A disturbing case from McKinney, Texas, has shocked both investigators and the public. 3-year-old Dawson Zamora was taken to a hospital in mid-October after suffering extensive injuries that doctors said were inconsistent with a fall. According to court filings, the child's mother, Chelsea Berg, had left him in the care of her boyfriend, Christopher Alexander. When Alexander brought the boy to the emergency department, he claimed that Dawson had fallen at home, but medical staff quickly realized that his wounds, bruises at different stages of healing, internal injuries, and bleeding on the brain, suggested a pattern of long-term abuse. Police were called, and both adults were soon taken into custody. Investigators later obtained text messages between Berg and Alexander that painted a clearer picture of what might have been happening in the weeks leading up to the boy's hospitalization. In those messages, Berg allegedly confronted Alexander about the injuries she had noticed on her son, warning him that the child was progressively getting more hurt every time they were alone together. Despite these warnings, prosecutors say Berg continued to leave Dawson in Alexander's care. For detectives, those messages became central evidence of what Texas law calls injury to a child by omission. When a parent or guardian fails to protect a child from known danger, Christopher Alexander faces multiple felony charges, including injury to a child, stalking, and tampering with evidence. He remains jailed on a high bond while awaiting trial. Chelsea Berg, arrested the same day, was released on bond and is charged with injury to a child by omission. Legal experts have described the case as unusually strong because the messages appear to prove Berg's awareness of ongoing abuse. If convicted, she could face anywhere from 5 years to life in prison. Former prosecutors told Law and Crime that the evidence is close to a smoking gun, making a plea deal likely rather than a lengthy trial. Meanwhile, Dawson's father has taken an active role in both the investigation and the public's effort to support his son. He reported that doctors initially found little brain activity on one side of the child's brain, and that the road ahead remains uncertain. A GoFundMe campaign created to help with medical expenses quickly raised tens of thousands of dollars as community members expressed outrage and sympathy. Family members continue to share updates, hoping for signs of recovery and pushing for accountability for those responsible. The case has sparked wider discussion in Texas about how domestic violence and child protection systems can fail to detect danger early enough. Experts note that caregivers who suspect abuse, especially parents who feel trapped in abusive relationships, need strong social and legal support to step away safely before tragedy occurs. Child safety advocates are using Dawson's story to call for better education on recognizing warning signs, mandatory reporting policies, and access to emergency shelters for at-risk families. While the legal process moves forward, Dawson's story stands as a painful reminder of the responsibility adults carry to protect the most vulnerable. As the investigation continues and the courts determine the outcome for Alexander and Berg, the community's focus remains on the young boy whose life has been permanently changed and on preventing similar tragedies in the future. When detectives from the McKinney Police Department first began piecing together what had happened to little Dawson, they realized early on that this was not going to be a simple case. What started as a medical emergency quickly turned into a full-scale criminal investigation, one that would expose not just the violence that took place inside a home, but also the warnings that went unanswered. Doctors who examined Dawson at the hospital were among the first to raise the alarm. Their reports described multiple injuries that, in their professional opinion, could not have come from a single fall. The bruising patterns, the different stages of healing, and the internal trauma all suggested something else: repeated physical abuse over time. Those findings were immediately forwarded to law enforcement, triggering an official child abuse investigation. When detectives questioned Christopher Alexander, they quickly realized that his explanation didn't match the evidence. He maintained that Dawson had fallen accidentally, but his story shifted slightly each time he told it. Investigators began comparing his statements to the timeline provided by Dawson's mother, Chelsea Berg. What they soon discovered on both of their phones would change everything. The text messages exchanged between Berg and Alexander painted a deeply disturbing picture of what was happening behind closed doors. In one message, Berg allegedly asked Alexander what was happening to her son when she wasn't there. In another, she noted that Dawson seemed to come home with new bruises every time the two were alone together. Despite her apparent concern, she continued to leave the child in Alexander's care. For detectives, those texts became critical evidence. They revealed awareness, proof that Berg knew her child was in danger, yet failed to act. Under Texas law, that awareness alone is enough to charge a parent with injury to a child by omission. Legal experts would later call it one of the clearest omission cases they had ever seen. Former prosecutor and legal analyst Nima Romani described the messages as close to a smoking gun as you'll ever get in a neglect or omission case, explaining that they demonstrated knowledge, awareness, and inaction all at once. As the investigation deepened, detectives compiled an exhaustive case file that included medical evidence, digital communications, phone records, and witness statements. Neighbors were questioned, and relatives came forward with details about growing tension between Berg and Alexander in the months leading up to the incident. Police also uncovered messages that hinted at controlling or threatening behavior from Alexander toward Berg, a dynamic prosecutors believed may have played a role in her failure to protect her son. The prosecution's challenge was to prove that Berg had real opportunities to protect Dawson and simply didn't take them. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, were preparing to argue that she was under emotional and psychological control, too terrified to intervene. It was a defense often seen in neglect cases tied to domestic violence, one that rarely succeeded but often revealed the painful complexity of what victims endure. Defense attorney Carla Jenkins later explained that this kind of situation isn't as rare as people might think. Parents who are victims themselves, she said, sometimes can't see a way out. The courts, she noted, must decide whether fear excuses inaction, or whether the child's suffering outweighs it. As the weeks went on, public attention intensified. Local news outlets began following the story daily, and social media was filled with outrage and heartbreak. A GoFundMe campaign launched by Dawson's family quickly surpassed $60,000 in donations. Messages of support poured in from across the country, many from parents who said they had once feared for their own children in similar situations. For investigators, the facts were becoming clearer by the day. For the community, the emotions were raw and powerful, and for Dawson's family, the fight was far from over. By the time the case moved from hospital hallways to the courtroom, the central question had shifted, from how this tragedy had happened to why it wasn't stopped sooner. It was no longer just about assigning blame, it was about understanding how so many warning signs could be missed, and how a child in danger could fall through the cracks of the very systems meant to protect him. The stage was now set for a courtroom battle that would test the limits of justice, accountability, and compassion. When the charges were formally read in a Collin County courtroom, the legal process shifted into a slower, more methodical phase. The questions that had haunted the community, why, how, and who, now moved into the realm of evidence, procedure, and accountability. In Texas, felony cases involving injury to a child are handled by the district court, where prosecutors must prove not only that harm occurred, but that it was either intentional or the result of criminal negligence. That single distinction determines everything, from bond conditions to the length of a possible sentence. For investigators, the arrests were only the beginning. Detectives continued to organize stacks of medical records, text message logs, and digital forensic reports. Every document, every line of metadata, had to meet strict standards of admissibility. A single misplaced timestamp, a missing signature, or a corrupted file could weaken an entire charge. The stakes were high, and so the process became painstakingly meticulous. Prosecutors worked closely with pediatric trauma specialists who could explain to a jury how different stages of bruising reveal a timeline of injury, and why certain patterns simply don't match accidental falls. They also brought in child protection workers to testify about prior welfare checks and the policies that govern how parents are expected to safeguard their children. In omission cases, explained former prosecutor and legal analyst Nima Romani, the challenge lies in proving what someone didn't do. The law treats that kind of failure as a form of conduct when a parent has a clear and legal duty to act. It's a subtle but powerful distinction, because while physical abuse leaves visible scars, omission leaves the silent ones, carved by neglect and inaction. As the attorneys prepared their arguments, the judge scheduled a series of preliminary hearings. Both sides met in court to debate bail conditions, evidence deadlines, and whether psychological evaluations would be permitted. Media outlets covered each session carefully, aware that the case had drawn national attention and public scrutiny. Reporters described a courtroom filled with quiet tension, families sitting in the back row, journalists typing notes, and prosecutors walking in with files stacked nearly a foot high outside the courthouse, the community continued to rally around Dawson's recovery. Candlelight vigils, fundraisers, and awareness walks transformed private grief into public purpose. Parents who had never met the child spoke his name in solidarity, determined that his suffering would not be in vain. Local organizations seized the moment to promote training programs for teachers, daycare staff, and healthcare professionals, teaching them how to recognize and report abuse before it escalates. Across North Texas, posters appeared in schools and clinics with a single message: if you see something, say something. Inside the justice system, the road ahead was expected to be long. In Texas, serious felony trials can take a year or more to conclude. Plea negotiations, psychological assessments, and pretrial motions often stretch the process further, testing the patience of families waiting for closure. But prosecutors remained firm in their promise of transparency. They reminded the public that accountability must come through law and evidence, not emotion or anger. Justice, they said, might move slowly, but it does move. Every filing, every hearing, and every argument brought the case one step closer to resolution. And while the court would ultimately determine guilt or innocence, advocates hoped for something even larger, a system more aware, more responsive, and better equipped to prevent the next tragedy before it happens. As the music fades in the background, the narration closes with a quiet but determined promise: from pain would come purpose, and from justice, reform. In interviews, family members expressed gratitude for the public support but urged everyone to focus on the lesson, not the headlines. They spoke about Dawson's resilience, the doctors fighting for his recovery, and the volunteers who visited the hospital to deliver toys, books, and comfort. To them, the case was no longer just a legal battle, it was a wake-up call for every parent and neighbor to trust their instincts and protect the vulnerable. By late in the year, several community-led initiatives had formed in Dawson's name. Local businesses sponsored Speak Up for Kids drives, and churches hosted candlelight walks to honor child abuse survivors. Counselors offered free sessions to parents struggling with stress or domestic tension. Social workers pointed out that many abuse cases begin not with evil intent, but with untreated anger, isolation, or desperation, problems that can often be resolved if help is sought early. As these efforts grew, so did a sense of purpose among those who had once felt helpless. Dawson's story became a symbol not only of tragedy but of change. The image of a small boy fighting for his life reminded people that justice isn't just about punishment, it's also about prevention. By turning heartbreak into advocacy, McKinney began to heal in the only way it could, by making sure no other child would suffer the same fate. In the months following the tragedy, Dawson's recovery became a symbol of both hope and heartbreak for everyone following the case. Doctors at the Dallas hospital treating him reported slow but encouraging signs of improvement. Although the injuries he suffered were severe, his medical team remained committed to giving him the best possible chance at healing. Rehabilitation specialists worked tirelessly to help restore his motor functions, while neurologists monitored his brain activity daily. Each flicker of progress, a hand movement, a reflex, a breath without assistance, was celebrated by nurses and family members as a victory. For Dawson's father and extended family, those small moments became their lifeline. They stayed by his side in rotating shifts, reading stories, playing gentle music, and bringing familiar toys to comfort him. Through social media updates, they shared glimpses of his journey, not for attention, but to remind people that behind every headline lies a child fighting to live. Their posts were filled with gratitude for the community's continued prayers and financial support. Many followers, some complete strangers, left heartfelt messages promising that Dawson's story had changed how they looked at their own children, neighbors, and responsibilities. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on the family was immense. Counselors working with them described how grief, anger, and confusion often surface in waves after such trauma. Yet through it all, there was also a deep resolve to ensure that Dawson's suffering would lead to greater awareness and compassion. Local therapy centers and faith groups offered resources for families facing similar crises, helping parents understand trauma recovery and the importance of self-care while navigating guilt or loss. The hospital itself became a place of quiet unity. Nurses who weren't assigned to Dawson's case would stop by his room simply to check in or offer words of encouragement. Volunteers dropped off stuffed animals and blankets donated by community members. Each gesture carried the same unspoken message, that even in the darkest circumstances, kindness can still light the way forward. Outside the hospital walls, Dawson's story continued to shape public discussion. Schools held assemblies where counselors spoke about empathy, kindness, and the importance of telling a trusted adult when something feels wrong at home. Police departments collaborated with child advocacy centers to create simpler reporting channels for suspected abuse. Social workers began visiting daycare facilities and parent support groups, teaching caregivers how to manage stress before it turned into danger. The city that had once been defined by shock was now becoming a model for reform. By early the next year, Dawson's case had become part of a larger movement across Texas to strengthen the network of support for vulnerable children. His father's unwavering advocacy inspired others to share their own experiences with neglect or domestic violence, breaking through the silence that so often allows abuse to continue. Though his future remained uncertain, Dawson's resilience offered a measure of peace to those who had followed his story from the beginning. He represented every child who cannot speak for themselves, every parent who vows to do better, and every community that chooses awareness over apathy. In the end, Dawson's journey was about more than recovery, it was about renewal. It showed that even from unimaginable pain, hope can take root when people unite with purpose. The scars may never fade entirely, but the lessons born from them can save lives for generations to come. As Dawson's recovery continued in the hospital, the wheels of justice began to turn. Prosecutors in Collin County assembled what they described as one of the most heartbreaking and clear-cut child abuse cases they had ever seen. Both defendants, Chelsea Berg and Christopher Alexander, were now at the center of a storm that drew national attention. Courtrooms filled with reporters, family members, and advocates, each hoping to see accountability delivered for the pain one little boy had endured.
The prosecution's case was built on months of evidence, hospital reports, witness statements, and the now infamous text messages that prosecutors said proved Berg's knowledge of the abuse. In opening statements, they presented a timeline showing a pattern of injury, neglect, and willful blindness. For Alexander, the case was more direct. Medical experts testified that Dawson's injuries were consistent with repeated blunt force trauma, not accidental falls. Detectives recounted how Alexander's story changed multiple times under questioning, each version unraveling as more forensic evidence surfaced. For Berg, the argument was more complex. Her defense attorneys attempted to paint her as a woman trapped in an emotionally abusive relationship, manipulated by a violent man. They claimed she was terrified to act, fearing that Alexander's rage would turn on her if she tried to intervene. But prosecutors countered that argument with compassion and precision, saying that fear does not excuse inaction when a child's life is at stake. She had a duty to protect him, the state argued, and she chose silence. The jury listened in heavy silence as Dawson's doctors described his injuries. Photos shown in court brought tears to even seasoned officers. One juror later said that the images and testimony made it impossible to sleep for days. The trial became a public reckoning, not just for the defendants, but for a system that so often misses the warning signs of abuse until it's too late. As the proceedings unfolded outside the courthouse, a quiet movement began to grow. Advocates and parents gathered, holding candles and posters with Dawson's smiling face. They demanded stronger background checks for caregivers, mandatory domestic violence